Who are the true kings of the golden era of thrash? Spoiler alert, the big four didn't all get top billing.
I am shocked and chagrined.
Today we are ranking 30 classic thrash metal bands only on the relative strength of their 80s output, and we're starting with Kreator. Germany's finest export of this era, if you ask me. So we've got Endless Pain in 1985, Pleasure to Kill in 1986, Terrible Certainty in 1987, and Extreme Aggression in 1989. Nearly an album a year, and what a run. Like, those are all incredible albums. They are just full of killer riffs, memorable songs, and fun vocals. So, for that reason, they are going to perfection to start us off strong. Next up is Flotsam and Jetsam. Little less to work with here. We've got Doomsday for the Deceiver in 1986 and No Place for Disgrace in 1988. They kind of waver between heavy metal and thrash metal, but I see them requested a lot. I enjoy this band, but honestly, these early albums don't do a whole lot for me personally. Like, they're good, but I don't know. I've just never felt inclined to revisit them after the fact just for fun, and so they are going to okay tier. Next up is Testament. Another strong run here. We've got The Legacy in 1987, The New Order in 1988, and Practice What You Preach in 1989. Really enjoy all of these albums except for Practice What You Preach. Not a huge fan of that. I know some people love that album, but still, I think it's really good. They've recycled some ideas that had already been put out in the decade kind of earlier on, but they just do them so well. And then Practice is where it feels a bit too much to me like a Metallica impression, where it's like the studio and the label just feels like it's polishing it too much and trying to market it as that to try to match that success. And that may or may not be true, but that's just how it feels to me. So for that reason, landed high, not quite at the top, but I'm putting them at fantastic. And we have Annihilator. So here we have Alice in Hell in 1989, the only 80s album from this Canadian thrash metal band, and it is a really good one. Like, I absolutely love this album. I'd probably put it pretty high if I did like an overall ranking of 80s thrash metal albums, and I think the fan rating on this fits that too. But again, if I'm weighing these in terms of the overall strength of what they put out in the 80s, if it's just one album, that's kind of falling short of a lot of the competition here. So for that reason, I am putting them at good tier, even if that is a fantastic album. Next up is Anthrax. It's like laughing with one hand. Come on, what is it? What is it? We have Fistful of Metal in 1984, Spreading the Disease in 1985, Among the Living in 1987, and State of Euphoria in 1988. Another pretty solid run, I would say. I'm not a huge fan of Fistful of Metal. I think that one's just kind of okay. And some people in the Discord really like State of Euphoria, but personally, I just do not care for it. I don't like that album much at all. It's a 7.7 fan rating here too, so I think that aligns more with how I feel about it. So that's kind of what pulls this one down for me, but Spreading the Disease and Among the Living are pretty darn close to being like 10 out of 10s. Splitting that down the middle, and they are going to great tier. Next is Dark Angel. So here we've got We Have Arrived in 1985, Darkness Descends in 1986, and Leave Scars in 1989. Another incredible run. I love all of these so much. I feel like We Have Arrived kind of sets the tone, and then they just get darker and more extreme as you get into these other two. It's just super miserable, fast, super heavy. It's kind of like Slayer with more extreme vocals is how I often think of these guys. I love banging my head to these albums, and so I'm going to put them also at perfection. Next up is Artillery. This Danish band has two 80s albums, Fear of Tomorrow in 1985 and Terror Squad in 1987. Both decent enough, but I've never been in love with either of them. Like, they're enjoyable enough, but they're also kind of messy, a little bit clunky, a little bit unfocused. For me, it's By Inheritance in 1990, where they really spread their wings. That's an album from them I absolutely love. But since that is not going to be included in this ranking, they are landing at just okay tier for me. And y'all, again, this is just my opinion. If you're enjoying the video so far, hit the like button. If you hate it, hit the dislike button and comment below what you agree with, what you disagree with. Let's get a conversation going. But next up, we are going with Exodus. Ooh, Nelly, we got Bonded by Blood in 1985, Pleasures of the Flesh in 1987, and Fabulous Disaster in 1989. Two major classics here, though I will still argue to the death that Pleasures of the Flesh is underrated and in many ways better as a whole than Fabulous Disaster, which I think has some weaker spots. But yeah, overall, incredible run. I mean, Bonded is just like a foundational record for the genre and one that many cite as one of their favorites. Lots of people like Fabulous Disaster. Two, I think it's going to go just south of perfection at fantastic. Next up is DRI. Alright, quite a few from these guys, and for some interesting reasons, because they don't start out as thrash, really. We got the Dirty Rotten LP in 1983, and Dealing With It in 1985, which I'd argue are both pretty just straight up punk, hardcore punk albums. Dealing With It starts to show a little bit more thrash influences, but it's with Crossover in 1987 that they really skip into the thrash territory. And then, of course, we also have Four of a Kind in 1988 and Thrash Zone in 1989. That last one being another instant classic, I would say. It took them a little while to, again, get into thrash material, but once it hits so hard. And they also largely define not only what it means to be crossover, but even coined the term. And so they get a lot of credit for that. Pulled down a little bit by those earlier efforts, and I don't think that even their best albums are necessarily perfect, but I'm going to put them at great tier. Then there's Sadus. Sadus only have one 80s album, being Illusions or Chemical Exposure, depending on where you listen to it. It goes by both titles. If we were ranking their full discography, this would land at least fantastic, but they didn't really truly get going until the 90s, I would say. Like, Swallowed in Black is where things, like, really take hold. A Vision of Misery is great. These two are kind of okay, but then A Shadow Inside was a great comeback, too. But again, we're just talking about the 80s here, and I gotta stand by my rules. It pains me, but I have to be fair that since they just have one 80s album, as good as it may be, it's not fantastic or anything, so I put them at good tier. Next up is Voivod. Alright, we have a bunch here. We've got War and Pain in 1984, Roarg in 1986, Killing Technology in 1987, Dimension Hatros in 1988, and Nothing Face in 1989. It doesn't get much better than that, honestly. Like, this period has all of their best albums, I would argue, except for Synchro Anarchy, which I also really enjoyed. Not to mention, they completely do their own thing when so many others were just following a blueprint at this point. I love the progressive and weird elements of these albums and just the band in general. I always think of them as kind of like, this is thrash performed by Primus. And so, for all of that, they are going to perfection. Then we have Heathen. Another one kind of slim pickings here. We've just got Breaking the Silence in 1987, and it's a good record, but again, not exactly my thing. I think the guitar work is great, but the songs feel a little bit bloated. I'm not as into the more heavy metal sounding vocals too. It's solid enough, but yeah, it landed pretty low for me. I'm going to put them at okay. Next up is Suicidal Tendencies.
Sometimes I try to do things, it just doesn't work out the way I want it to, and I get real frustrated.
And I want to reiterate to YouTube, I don't have them. That's the name of the band. Don't demonetize my video because of the name of the band. Anyways, got a couple here too. We've got the titular album in 1983. We have Join the Army in 1987. How Will I Laugh Tomorrow When I Can't Even Smile Today in 1988. All solid albums. I give them credit for doing something very different too. And I think this band in general really is just very preference driven. I feel like this is a band you either enjoy or you kind of don't enjoy them at all. I find them to be kind of hit and miss. I like certain songs. I don't really love any single one of these albums, and Mike's vocals are definitely an acquired taste. Like, that's bound to have turned many, many a listener away, because he can be, frankly, kind of goofy sounding. But yeah, I mean, I gotta give them credit for their impact. They're another big part of crossover thrash. So some people might be mad at this, but again, remember, this is very preference driven, especially with this one, but they're just going to good tier for me. Next up, we have Toxik.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into the show.
Two albums here, but man, are they incredible. We've got World Circus, which I would call a 10 out of 10 in 1987, and Think This in 1989 that I'd call like an 8.59 out of 10. Both also very inventive albums. Think This especially goes in some weird kind of technical, progressive directions. I adore this band. If they had even just one more album in this era, and I gotta say Dismorta from 2022 is also awesome. But again, just sticking to the 80s, there's just two albums. I wanted to put them at perfection because they're just so good. But again, they're kind of coming in a little light in the decade, and so for that reason, I put them at fantastic. Next up is Razor. Some Canadians coming in here hot with their Terminator love. We've got Executioner Song in 1985, Evil Invaders in 1985, Malicious Intent in 1986, and Custom Killing 1987, and Violent Restitution in 1988. Another really, really, really solid run. Very consistent, very strong. Love the kind of Motorhead speed metal vibes mixed in with these guys, which always just makes for a really fun time. Like, I always throw on their records and I just have a good time. Not top shelf for me. No one of these albums really competes super high, but they're, again, that consistency goes away. So I'm going to put them at great tier. Then we have the mighty Sepultura. All right, we got three here. We got Morbid Visions in 1986, Schizophrenia in 1987, and Beneath the Remains in 1989. Given Brazil its due here. I just did their full discography tier list, so you can check that out if you haven't already. But man, what an incredible run of 80s albums here. Like, and all for different reasons. Like, Morbid Visions is such an influence on early black metal, and I love just how raw and ugly and kind of charming it is, and just how kind of messed up it is. Schizophrenia is one of my favorites. I think it's the perfect balance of maintaining that darkness of their early sound while taking on influences from things like Metallica. And then Beneath the Remains is obviously a classic that so many people love. It took me a while to get into it, but yeah, I get it. I get it. This felt obvious to me. This one also has to go to perfection. Then we have Death Angel. These guys have been kind of a fan favorite here, but I have definitely mixed feelings. So we've got two albums here, The Ultraviolence in 1987, which I absolutely love. Like, I think that's another, like, at least 9 out of 10 record. But then we got Frolic in the Park in 1988 that some people also love. I do not like that album. I do not like it really much at all. And I like Act 3 even less, but that's getting into the 90s and another territory. But I do think that kind of sullies my opinion a little bit. They've come back around and put out some other albums that I've really enjoyed. But as far as the 80s goes, it's really split. And enough so, and I know some people are going to be mad about this, but they got dragged down to good. If the second album had been as strong as the first, they could have easily been at least up here. But yeah, they're going to good for me. Then we have Sacred Reich. All right, another single album Andy here. We've got Ignorance in 1987, which again, really strong debut, but another band that also leaves a bad taste in my mouth because they kind of fall off after that. The American Way is pretty good, and then Independent is just terrible. If we're just ranking the first album on its own as an album, probably great, fantastic tier, something like that. But again, they're coming on with one album that's like not quite as good as some of the other albums on here anyways too, so another one that just landed at okay for me. Next up is Coroner. We've got R.I.P. in 1987, Punishment for Decadence in 1988, and No More Color in 1989. This Swiss thrash metal band rips, y'all. Like, I'm really glad I got introduced to them because they were a band I didn't really know about until not that long ago, but they have incredible riffs, great vocals, just full package. All three of these albums are wonderful, and I think they get progressively better, with No More Color being my favorite. And I also would say that I enjoy them more each time I listen to them too. Like even this most recent time going back, they were a little lower before, but yeah, they got pulled up all the way to fantastic. Just really excellent stuff that doesn't get talked about enough. And we have Overkill. 4 Overkill albums in the 80s, Feel the Fire in 1985, Taking Over in 1987, Under the Influence in 1988, and The Years of Decay in 1989. That last one being my personal favorite and a lot of people's favorite. It's the fan favorite on this list with an 8.7 overall. Man, those first 2 albums are not necessarily my taste, but there's a lot of defenders for them. If you like that more kind of heavy metal style, those tend to be like pretty popular. People like them. I've had a lot of defenders for them in the discography. I'm more into the Under the Influence and Beyond era, where they kind of got a little bit more attitude, went more overtly thrash, a little bit heavier too, I would say. And yeah, like I said, Years of Decay is like pretty much a perfect album too. Credit also for their role in helping to kickstart the groove metal sound. I don't love these albums as much as some of the others here though, so ultimately they ended up at great tier, which I think is fair. Continuing with our big 4, we have Megadeth. Alright, we got a trio here. Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good in 1985. Peace Sells But Who's Buying in 1986. And So Far, So Good, So What in 1988. I gotta say, I'm a little bummed that Rust in Peace is not included in here, because I will say that's my favorite Megadeth album by far, by like a mile. And again, the fan ratings here kind of suss that out too, because it's the only album on here that has a 9 or above. It's a 9.3. Everything else is somewhere at an 8 or even lower than that. And so it's a little bit of a loss for that to just be a year outside of this. These 3 albums, though, really great in their own right. Love the debut. I think it's a really strong one. And I've voiced the opinion that I actually like it better than Kill 'Em All, personally. I love the attitude and the aggression. Peace Sells has some incredible songs on it that I absolutely love, including the title track, but it's got some filler, too. I think Megadeth fans sometimes don't consider some of the filler on some of these. And then So Far, So Good, So What, I think is like half filler and not an album I really, really, really enjoy. So that pulls it down a bit, but like the strengths are so high, the high points are so high. And these are albums that, for better or worse, I do actually find myself going back to more. So I did still end up putting it at fantastic. Did not land at perfection. We also have Nuclear Assault. They give us Game Over in 1986, Survive in 1988, and Handle with Care in 1989. Consistent, but rarely among my favorites. I think they have really great guitar work, love the sheer speed, but the vocals really tend to get on my nerves, if I'm being honest. Like, it pulls me out of it. Sometimes the production is pretty awful, too. Like, of these 3, I actually think I like Handle with Care probably the most, but that album also has just, like, pretty abysmal production. I like me some raw production, but this is that, like, production that like sounds like it's like peaking and it's like poorly mixed, and it hurts my ears. Call me a baby if you want to, but yeah, that brought it down quite a bit for me. So they went to just okay, and I think some people are going to be upset about that, but my list, my rules. Next up is Vio-Lence. Another single album, Andy. We've got Eternal Nightmare in 1988, but what an album it is. Like, just really fun stuff. Love listening to this thing. The riffs on here are so good. I highly recommend it. But another one also where the vocals are kind of hit and miss. Like, he's another kind of acquired taste. They sound genuinely bad in some places. It sort of works, but I do like it more than Nuclear Assault when it comes down to it. And even though it's just one album, I like this album more than any of those Nuclear Assault albums. So this one went to good tier. Then we have Tankard. All right, there's Zombie Attack in 1986, Chemical Invasion in 1987, and The Morning After in 1988. Frankly, I think these Germans are kind of underrated. They don't have the most memorable albums on this list, but they are very consistently fun and just bring a lot of energy. I know a lot of them ended up kind of low when I did the album tier list, but it's just because of the competition, man. The competition in this era is so strong. And so they had trouble rising above because they're just a little bit maybe more forgettable. But man, every time I throw them on, I consistently have fun all the way through. Like, I think they're really good start to finish listens, and maybe they'll grow on me even more. They'll rise in the list. I haven't listened to them maybe as much as some of these other bands, but I do think they're kind of underrated. I think they get shit on a little bit unfairly. Their newer stuff gets shit on, including by me, pretty fairly, I would say, but their old stuff is quite good. I'm putting them at great tier. All right, another big four. The big one, we got Metallica.
Darkness imprisoning me. All that I see, absolute horror.
With Metallica, we've got Kill 'Em All in 1983, Ride the Lightning in 1984, Master of Puppets in 1986, and Justice for All in 1988. This is like the quintessential discography run. Like, I crap on Metallica a ton. When I do full discography rankings of just the bands, like, they come out kind of low for me because after this point they fall off pretty hard. They have some ups and downs. You know, I like elements of the other albums, but man, this is just a pristine 80s discography. Like, it just doesn't get any better. It really doesn't. Like, what more needs to be said? I hate to be boring and a basic bitch, but like, it's obvious that Metallica's 80s albums need to go to perfection, like pretty much at the top. It's just unbeatable. But next up, we have Sodom. Germany's second best export, in my opinion. We've got Obsessed by Cruelty in 1986, another big black metal influence. We've got Persecution Mania in 1987, and the classic Agent Orange in 1989. Not perfect. I have some issues with some of the production here too, and also some of the slower songs just don't hit as well for me, making for kind of inconsistent run times. There are skips on these albums, which I factored in, but when they hit, they hit. And so for that, I thought they fit pretty well at Fantastic. Then we have Destruction. Kind of lower on the German totem pole for me, but we've got some spectacular albums here in Infernal Overkill in 1985, Eternal Devastation in 1986, and Release from Agony in 1987. I have listened to all these albums, and I'm hoping if we get a new one, I will finally do a discography tier list. But just looking at these 80s albums, another very kind of consistent but not usually my favorites of a given year example, I would say. Really strong showing, but all of these I have some issues with, whether it be with production, songwriting, some bloat, some inconsistencies. So yeah, good to throw on. Not perfect. I felt like they kind of fell around the middle, so they're going to great tier as well. Then we have Xentrix.
Turn on the TV.
I know I left some names off of this list, but Xentrix is often one that gets commented, and so I wanted to make sure they were on here for better or worse, but they only have Shattered Existence in 1989, and being that it's the last year of the decade, I think it's a strong debut, but it feels a little bit superfluous at this point by comparison. Just sort of retreading the same ideas that have already been done better by other albums. I'm also not in love with the vocals, so, you know, fine showing, but ultimately, with just one album and it being kind of meh for me, it's going to okay. We also have Metal Church. Now, personally, I feel a little weird including these guys since I still think of them more as a heavy metal band instead of a thrash metal band, but they definitely do both, and they're also probably the most commented band when I don't include them in my thrash videos. Just look through any thrash video I've done where I haven't mentioned Metal Church. There will be multiple comments saying, "Where's Metal Church?" Well, here it is, with Metal Church in 1984, The Dark in 1986, and Blessing in Disguise in 1989. Now, I like when they get more overtly thrashy on tracks like Over My Dead Body, Rest in Pieces, The Spell Can't Be Broken, and my favorite Nightmare, but not as into the big heavy metal power ballad stuff like Gods of Wrath and Watch the Children Pray. That said, I can't deny the massive talent on display, especially in the vocal department. I would rank them higher on a heavy metal list, but here again, this is very a personal preference thing. Again, mad respect. I think that what they do is incredible. I think their songwriting is really good. Their production is excellent. So there's a lot going for them, but me personally, I just put them at good tier. And then we have Slayer. I mean, do I really even need to say the names here? You can say them with me. We got Show No Mercy in 1983. We've got Hell Awaits in 1985. Rain and Blood in 1986. And South of Heaven in 1988. What needs to be said again? And that's without Seasons in the Abyss, which is another one of my favorites in 1990, which is a great kind of closing year for the classic era of thrash. But with just these four even, it's phenomenal. It's crazy. It's insane. Show No Mercy is just so intense. More kind of black metal influencing stuff there. Hell Awaits is just pure hellfire. Rain and Blood, what do you need to say? South of Heaven isn't one of my all-time favorites, but it's still like a classic in its own right. So you know the deal. Also has to go to perfection. Y'all check out this playlist for plenty more thrash metal tier lists, whether it be by album or full discographies from single bands, many of which were featured here. And again, comment down below, what are your favorites? What are your least favorites? What would you throw on this list that I didn't? But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.